ask José Meirinhos, Professor José Meirinhos, the head of department, and I thank José for being here. And José will introduce John McGregor, or so go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for joining you only now, but I have classes. I'm very happy for this opportunity to introduce Professor John Greco. Everybody knows his work. John Greco is professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, and before Georgetown, taught at the St. Louis University, where he ran from 2013 to 2015 a 3.3 million project funded by the Templeton Foundation on intellectual humility, co-directed with Eleanor Stump, that is a Greek scholar in my own field of research, medieval philosophy. Yeah. 22 years ago, she was here in an important congress where she taught on Thomas Aquinas. And Professor John Greco completed his PhD at Brown University in 1989 under the supervision of another great philosopher, Professor Ernest Sosa, who is a main scholar in the same field of research, and both now are major figures in contemporary epistemology. And from 2013 and 2020, he had an important service for the philosophical community, being the editor of the American Philosophical Quarterly. John Greco is not only a great scholar and a great philosopher, but is engaged in academic life this way, promoting young researchers too, and with this service, editing this great journal. For the description of the philosophical work Professor Greco is doing, I suggest to visit his website, a very rich website where we can read an interesting self-portrait that I will quote now. My main interests are, we need breath to read all that. My main interests are in epistemology, including virtue epistemology, social epistemology, religious epistemology, and skepticism. I also have great general interests in issues around mind and agency, and historical interests in Thomas Reid, Hume, More, and Wittgenstein. This is...
Don't take that too seriously.
You can see that all that is very seriously addressed. And among a lot of very important books, I emphasize the two last ones, The Transmission of Knowledge and Virtue Theoretic Epistemology, New Methods and Approaches, co-edited with Christopher Kelp. Professor John Greco's today talk is on how to socialize virtual epistemology, and for the follow-up of the discussion and to have more documentation, I suggest to read the try virtual epistemology at the Stanford Encyclopedia, an entry that is co-authored by John Greco. Thank you so much for being
Thank
with
you.
us and to have this opportunity to discuss with you. And I must thank the three researchers that organized this meeting, Domingos Faria, Vitor Guerreiro, and Tiago Veloso. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for that really nice introduction. So, my wife thought that it was ironic that I got this big grant on intellectual humility. She said, like, how did you get a grant on intellectual humility? And I said, look, you don't have to have cancer to study oncology. You know, I mean, there's no there's no requirement that you're actually intellectually humble to get this grant. So anyway, so the talk now is on how to socialize virtue epistemology, and this is part of a larger project where I'm trying to think about what's important about the social turn in epistemology. So everybody knows that in recent years, social epistemology has been, very of central interest, and it's really expanded the field of epistemology in general. And usually when if you get an article, like an encyclopedia entry or a handbook or a guidebook on social epistemology, what you get is a list of topics, right? Epistemic injustice, epistemology of testimony, disagreement, systems epistemology, group epistemology, all these different topics. And I'm trying to think about what is the common theme? Like, what's important? What's important here? What's interesting here that has where people really should be paying attention? So that's a broader project, and so within that, I'm trying to think about how best to think of virtue epistemology from a social perspective. So that's what this talk is about. So just to give you a very rough idea about what I think is going on in social epistemology across all these different topics, the idea I'm working with is that social epistemology in general explores varieties of social epistemic dependence. In other words, the ways in which we depend epistemically on other persons and our relationships to other persons, and also on broader features of the social environment. So whereas traditional epistemology was really about what are my own individual resources for determining what I should believe, what I should know, and it was very much framed in terms of the individual's resources for how to believe. Social epistemology really explores varieties of ways in which we depend on other people, and also broader features of the social environment, maybe structural features of the social environment for what we should believe or what we can know. But what I'm thinking is that what's really important here is not just any kind of dependence on other persons or on the social environment, but what I think of as a kind of vulnerable dependence. A kind of dependence on other persons, for example, without any guarantee that that other person is going to be dependable. Or a kind of reliance on features of the social environment without any guarantee that the social environment is going to be reliable. And so in a way, social epistemology is a kind of extension of externalism in epistemology, where in the earlier externalist turn said, look, if you want to understand rational or reasonable belief, if you want to understand knowledge, you can't look at just what's going on inside the head, right? You can't look at just what's going on internal to the subject. You have to look at the relationship to a broader physical environment. So, for example, for perceptual knowledge, you have to have an enabling physical environment. The physical environment has to be structured a certain way in order for perceptual knowledge to even be possible. And so, again, there's this externalist turn where we start to analyze perceptual knowledge, for example, not just in terms of what's going on in the head, but causal and other modally strong relationships to the physical environment. So you can think of social epistemology as an extension of that idea. It's not just the physical environment that has to be enabling for human beings. The social environment also has to be enabling for human beings, but in ways that you might not have any kind of independent access to like sort of justifying in a non-circular way. Like I might not have any way to guarantee myself in a non-circular way that my physical environment is in fact enabling rather than disabling, or that my social environment is enabling rather than disabling. So I think that's what's important about social epistemology in general, is exploring the various ways in which our epistemic standing is vulnerable to and dependent upon, in that sense, on our relationships to other persons and to the social environment more broadly. So, in that sense, social epistemology at its best, when it's doing what is really insightful about social epistemology, social epistemology at its best is anti-individualist. And in the sense that you're not looking at just what's going on in the individual to understand epistemic phenomena, you're looking at what's beyond the individual as well. Now, a important and to some extent persistent criticism of virtue epistemology is that it's too individualist, right?
Yeah.
That when you're talking about knowledge being grounded in the epistemic, in the intellectual virtues of the knower, usually that's what you're thinking of is the individual virtues, of the virtues of the individual. And so there's a sense in which virtue epistemology, at least in its earliest forms, was a kind of individualism, and maybe too individualist, in that it was looking at too much at like what's going on in the individual rather than these broader relationships. And so from my point of view, that was a mistake. And so hence the topic, how to socialize virtue epistemology, where you can still retain a lot of the theoretical power of the view, but in a way that isn't overly individualistic. Okay, so that's basically what this talk is about. So let me see. So I'm controlling this by what? How am I controlling this? Okay. Okay, so goals of the paper. One goal of the paper is to better understand the distinction between anti-reductionism and anti-individualism in the epistemology of testimony. Because a lot of the conversation in the epistemology of testimony is framed in terms of this reductionist versus anti-reductionist views. And I think that from a social epistemic perspective, that's not as important as the distinction between individualism and anti-individualism. So that's the first thing I want to convince you of in this talk, and to show that it's anti-individualism rather than anti-reductionism that best captures the structure of this social turn in epistemology. And then third, to show that not all anti-reductionist accounts, including not all anti-reductionist virtue theoretic accounts, qualify as anti-individualist theories. So for example, I'm going to argue that on the most natural interpretation of Linda Zagzybski's theory and of Ernest Sosa's theory, they're anti-reductionist, but they're not anti-individualist, okay? And I want to show that my own joint agency account of testimonial knowledge is in fact anti-individualist. Now notice that this isn't exactly a defense of the joint agency account, right? It would be indirectly if you're starting from the assumption that a correct account has to be anti-individualist, then it's starting to be a defense. But I'm not really so much concerned to defend my account as to show that it's anti-individualist in the way that I think whatever correct account should be. Okay. So here's the outline of the talk. First, I'm going to try to explain this distinction between anti-reductionism and anti-individualism. Then talk a little bit about my joint agency account from the transition of knowledge that Tiago thinks so poorly of. And then Zagzebski's rational trust theory, and then Souza's test on testimonial knowledge. Okay. So first, anti-reductionism and anti-individualism defined. So actually, first, I haven't talked about reductionism. So I'm understanding that distinctions a bit differently than was in the previous talks. So for me, reductionism in the epistemology of testimony is simply the view that testimonial knowledge reduces to some other kind of knowledge, such as inductive knowledge. Mm-hmm. So the most famous example of reductionism would be Hume. In Hume's epistemology of testimony, when the way you get testimonial justification or knowledge is just by your past experience of previous speakers and testimony. And so really the principles of the epistemology of testimony are just the principles of the epistemology of induction. Testimony is just a special case. So it's in that sense that testimonial knowledge and evidence and justification reduce to inductive justification, knowledge, evidence, etc. Okay? Or some other familiar categories. Maybe a combination of perceptual knowledge and inductive knowledge or something like that. Okay? Anti-reductionism, on my view, is simply a denial of reductionism. Okay, so it's not this default justification theory. That's just one kind of non-reductionism or anti-reductionism, right? So anti-reductionism in the epistemology of testimony is a broad tent. Mm-hmm. It's just the rejection of this reductionist view. Okay, so basically what the anti-reductionist is saying is that you need a special epistemology for testimony. You can't just think that testimonial knowledge is like inductive knowledge. You need to give it its own treatment. You need to give it its own special treatment. And then different anti-reductionists would disagree about what that treatment is. Okay, so that's anti-reductionism versus reductionism. Now, individualism versus anti-individualism. First pass on individualism is that a person's epistemic standing is always entirely a function of their own capacities or resources or doings, okay? Whereas anti-individualism would, again, simply be the denial of that, right? A person's epistemic standing, at least sometimes, depends on the epistemic standing or quality or doings of other persons and or on epistemic features of the broader social environment, okay? So we could think of individualism as a supervenience thesis. If you want to understand epistemic phenomena or epistemic standings or epistemic goods, what you have to do is to see how they supervene on what's going on in the individual. Whereas the anti-individualist is saying, no, that's not going to work. If you want to understand these epistemic phenomena, you have to see how they supervene on this broader set of facts, not just facts about an individual, but facts about how the individual is related to other individuals, the social environment, etc. Now, the next point is that anti-reductionism and anti-individualism can come apart. Not all anti-reductionist views are anti-individualist views. So an example would be traditional virtue epistemology. On a traditional virtue epistemology, testimonial justification and knowledge does not reduce to just induction. You have special virtues that are dedicated to the evaluation of speakers and their testimony. So it might be kind of some mind reading capacities, it might be some kind of social sensibilities that you're trained up with, but you have individual virtues that are not to be understood as just inductive reasoning. You have individual virtues that are dedicated to evaluating speakers and their testimony. So that's an anti-reductionist view, right? But it's still individualist, because those special dedicated virtues are virtues of the individual, and so it's really the resources of the individual that are doing the epistemic work in testimonial justification and knowledge, okay? Another example of an anti-reductionist view that's not anti-individualist would be these, like a Burge theory, or other theories in this family where you say, look, the way you understand testimonial justification and knowledge is the individual has a prima facie entitlement to believing the testimony, but then if the individual has counter evidence or evidence in favor or evidence against, that's going to decide whether ultimately there's justification or whether there's knowledge. So it's all about the individual, okay? So it's anti-reductionist. It's not talking about inductive justification, but it's not anti-individualist because it's still everything's going on within the individual to determine the epistemic status of the testimonial belief. Okay. All right. All right. So just want to see how I'm doing here because
we have time.
I'm kind of worried. I'm being kind of wordy here. Okay. When did I start?
At 10 to 5.
Yeah, so I've been going about 15 minutes.
Yeah,
okay. Okay.
No problem.
Okay, so here's a more careful definition of anti-individualism. And I'm going to define anti-individualism in terms of this prior category of social epistemic dependence. Okay. So on this view, a subject S epistemically depends on a social environment E, and here I'm just putting persons and social environments all in the same category. I'm assuming that other persons are a part of the social environment. Okay. So subject S epistemically depends on a social environment E, including other persons in that social environment. For S's knowledge that P, just in case, S is having knowledge that P supervenes on epistemic property phi of E. Is that phi? Is that phi or psi? Psi, okay. So S is having knowledge that P supervenes on some epistemic property psi of E. So for example, maybe the reliability of the testifier or the trustworthiness of the testifier, or something like that. But also, S is having knowledge that P does not supervene on S's knowledge that E has psi. Okay. So clause 1 ensures this broader supervenience thesis that the subject's epistemic standing supervenes not just on what's going on in the individual, but on the epistemic properties of a broader set of facts about the social environment and about other persons. Okay. Clause 2 captures the idea that it's not just dependence, it's vulnerable dependence. Mm-hmm. So that S's knowledge doesn't supervene on S's having knowledge that the other people or the social environment has these properties. Okay. And so when you get that idea of social epistemic dependence, then anti-individualism can just be defined in this way, that a theory is anti-individualist if it allows for that kind of social epistemic dependence a theory is anti-individualist if it doesn't allow for that kind of vulnerable epistemic dependence. So those definitions are in terms of knowledge, but you can actually give a broader definition in terms of epistemic standings more generally. So you can say for any epistemic property phi, a subject epistemically depends on the social environment for phi, just in case for some proposition P, S is having phi with respect to that belief supervenes on some epistemic property psi of the environment. That's the broader supervenience claim. And then but 2, S is having phi with respect to S's belief that P does not supervene on S is having phi or some other more demanding property with respect to S's belief that E has phi. So again, first clause, supervenience thesis, broadens it out. Second clause says, but it's vulnerable dependence. It's not going to be like, and you know about that stuff. It's like, that's not required. Okay? All right. So again, some theories are anti-individualist, but still are anti-reductionist, but still individualist. So traditional virtue epistemology, what Peter Graham calls fundamentalism, but any kind of no defeaters theory or default justification theory. Okay. Okay, here are some theories that are anti-individualist. So Lackey's mixed theory is, in Lackey's phrase is it takes two to tango, right? So what she's saying is that epistemic justification and knowledge supervene on some stuff about the individual and some stuff about the testifier, right? Goldberg's extended process reliabilism is also anti-individualist because he's saying that you have to look at not just the reliable processes going on inside the hearer's head, but you have to extend out and see what are the reliable processes going on in the speaker and in the exchange between the speaker and the hearer. So again, he's broadening out that supervenience base. But neither Lackey or Goldberg add a clause that, and the speaker, the hearer understands all of this, right? They're both externalist theories in the sense that it's just that these conditions have to hold. It's not that the hearer has to know that they hold, right? So again, it's a kind of externalism now applied to a social set of facts. Okay. But another anti-individualist account is my joint agency theory in the transmission of knowledge. So I won't go into that a lot, but the basic idea is that, on my view, the transmission of knowledge via testimony involves a kind of joint agency where the speaker and the hearer are working together in order to ensure a transmission of knowledge. So in cases of transmitted knowledge, success is attributable not to the individual virtues of the hearer, but to the virtuous joint agency of the speaker and the hearer working together. So note the distinction here between attributing success to virtuous joint agency versus attributing success to the hearer's part in the virtuous joint agency. Okay? So on an individualist view, you're still grounding testimonial knowledge in the hearer's participation in this virtuous joint cooperation. Whereas what I want to do is I want to ground knowledge in the virtuous cooperation rather than the hearer's part or participation in that cooperation. Okay? So there there are a couple of key ideas here. That I'm taking from this notion of joint agency or shared agency from action theory. Okay, so action theory. So for example, Margaret Gilbert, Bratman, Searle. There are various people trying to understand this notion of joint agency. But one sort of hallmark of joint agency is some kind of shared intention. Okay, what we're trying to do is distinguish the difference between two people doing something separately and two people doing something together. So I really like Margaret Gilbert's example of walking to a restaurant together. Okay, so she points out that two people might, by coincidence, be walking to the same restaurant. They might be even walking physically side by side to the same restaurant, but they're doing it as individuals. Neither one of them knows what the other is doing. They're not walking to the restaurant together in the sense that we're after. Okay? So what's the difference between you and I, or all of us walking to the restaurant together, and just doing it as individuals? So one hallmark of joint agency, most theorists agree, is that a shared intention. So we share an intention that we are going to walk to the restaurant together. Another hallmark is common understanding of the shared intention. So it's not just that we all intend to go to the restaurant together, but I understand that you have that intention, and you understand that I have that intention. And so there's this common understanding of the shared intention. And then the third hallmark is a kind of cooperation or interaction in order to fulfill that intention. So if we're walking to the restaurant together, you're committed to do what you need to do for that to happen. And I'm committed to do what I need to do for that to happen, within reason. So for example, if you need to slow down, or if you need to stop and tie your shoe, we're all going to stop and wait for you to tie your shoe. Or if I need to make a stop on the way, we'll all go and, accommodate me. And that kind of cooperation or interaction is also a hallmark of joint agency, okay? Another great example that I use is passing a ball, okay? So when you're playing catch, you have a shared intention. You both understand that you have that shared intention, and you're interacting or cooperating to have that game of catch. So I use that analogy of passing a ball to explicate this idea of passing knowledge or transmitting knowledge through testimony. And the idea is that the way to understand this phenomenon is that the speaker and the hearer are involved in this kind of joint or shared agency with a common intention and a common understanding of that intention and a cooperation to pull it off, okay? In the literature, testimony is usually just this like one-off assertion, and then, magically you get testimonial knowledge. Not magically. Everybody has a different account of how that happens, but it's usually just this one-off assertion. But I think in real life, even if we can get knowledge through a one-off assertion, we at least stand ready to interact in a way to share that knowledge. So for example, you might ask a question to clarify, or the speaker or the hearer might ask a question to clarify, well, what do you mean? Or what do you need to know? Or the hearer might have a doubt and express the doubt, and the speaker addresses the doubt, right? So there's this interaction in order to get the hearer to get the knowledge that the speaker has. Okay? And I want to say that that's the way to understand. Okay, now, I think it's a good account. But my point here is not that it's right, but that it's anti-individualist, okay? Because what I'm saying is that on this account, testimonial knowledge and justification supervenes not just on what the hearer is doing, but on this virtuous exchange or competent exchange between the speaker and the hearer. Okay. Not all virtue theories are like that. So let's Oh, just one more point. I think the reason I'm focused on this notion of joint agency or shared agency is because I think it's a really nice way to capture this idea of vulnerable dependence. Because when we're doing something together, I have no guarantee that you're going to do your part. Like when we're walking to the restaurant together, you might just bail, right? Or in some other kind of cooperative endeavor, if it's really joint or shared agency, in most cases, we're depending on each other to do our part. And so this idea of not just dependence, but vulnerable dependence is like built right into this notion of shared or joint agency. So I think it's a nice theoretical category to bring to epistemology to capture this idea of social epistemic dependence. I don't think it's the only way to capture the idea of social epistemic dependence, but if you have joint agency, you probably are fulfilling that broader notion of social epistemic dependence that I was that I had up earlier. Okay. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples of virtue theoretic accounts of testimonial justification and knowledge that don't have this anti-individualist feature. Okay, so the first account would be that I want to look at is Zagzebski's. Okay. So she's got what I call a rational trust theory. The essence of her account is that you're justified in believing testimony if your trust in the testifier is rational. Okay? So I am rationally committed Well, here's an explanation of why she thinks that trusting another person can be a reason to believe what they say, okay? I am rationally committed to have a minimal degree of trust in all other people, since all other people have the same basic belief-forming faculties that I trust in myself. I have a stronger reason to trust other people when the conscientious use of my faculties leads me to believe that they are conscientious in the use of their faculties. When I trust someone else for the purpose of getting the truth and they believe in a way I trust, I have a reason to believe the same thing. The reason is defeasible, but it's a reason, okay? Now, of course, Zagzebski doesn't think that all trust is reasonable trust. She's got this condition on reasonable trust, that what makes trust reasonable either in myself or in other people, is that it survives conscientious self-reflection. Okay? So that does not mean that trust is always a sufficient reason. This is Zagzebski, to trust what someone else trusts. Reasonable trust needs to satisfy conscientious self-reflection, just as every other part of our psyche needs to satisfy conscientious self-reflection in order to be reasonable. My view, Zagzebski's view, is that trust in another person is justified by my conscientious judgment that trusting that person will survive my own conscientious self-reflection. So that suggests that her view is that a hearer is justified in believing a speaker's testimony, that P, just in case S has reasonable trust in S's regarding S's belief that P. Moreover, S has reasonable trust, the hearer has reasonable trust in the speaker just in case the hearer's trust satisfies conscientious self-reflection, or alternatively, she put it this other way in one of those passages, the hearer is conscientiously judging that trusting S will survive H's own conscientious self-reflection. So I just want to point out that on Zagzebski's view, this is anti-reductionist. She's not, as soon as you bring trust into the picture and you make trust essential for testimonial justification and knowledge, you've got an anti-reductionist view. Because epistemologists aren't talking about trust for induction or, for memory knowledge or perceptual knowledge, right? So just the fact that she's using this category of trust is making it a kind of anti-reductionist view. She's saying that testimony requires this special sort of trust of the speaker. But nevertheless, it remains individualist because it makes testimonial justification a function of the hearer's individual resources for conscientious self-reflection, right? It goes back to whether that trust can survive my own conscientious self-reflection. Depending on what that means, depending on what surviving conscientious self-reflection means, it's either a version of the no-defeater theory, right? Or it's a version of the traditional virtue theoretic view where you've got these special capacities for evaluating the speaker. But in both cases, it's an individualist view, right? Okay. All right. Let's next turn to Souza's theory. So, Souza's theory looks like it's social, and he will tell you that it is. Okay. But what I'm going to argue is that even though in a way he's bringing in other people in the broader social environment, he's not doing it in a way that we should consider actually anti-individualist. Okay. So here's Souza. According to the proposed solution, this is his solution to. Basically, he's addressing Lackey's criticism that virtue theory is too individualist, okay? And he's arguing that it need not be. Okay. According to the proposed solution, the fullest credit often belongs to a group, even a motley group, seated in the group collectively, is a competence whose complex exercise leads through testimonial links to the correctness of one's present belief. He's thinking of one being the recipient of the final testimony in a testimonial chain. Okay. The correctness of one's belief is still attributable in part to the competence seated in one himself individually, but the credit that one earns will then be partial at best. So this idea of partial credit is going to be important. Okay. A quarterback's pass might derive from his competence, while its great success, its being a touchdown pass, manifests more fully the team's competence. Similarly for one's testimonial derived belief. So how should we understand Souza here? How should we interpret it? So my first point is that although he invokes this notion of passing a ball within a team context, although he invokes that notion, it's not clear he's talking about joint agency. Right? That passage is ambiguous about how he's thinking of that individual within this broader context. Okay? But let's interpret him that way. Let's say it's joint agency. Okay. But now remember that distinction I was talking about earlier between success attribution to virtuous joint agency, attributing success to virtuous joint agency versus attributing success to one's part in that virtuous joint agency. Okay? I embrace the former idea that testimonial knowledge, at least when we're thinking about the kind of cases I'm thinking about in transmitting knowledge, the knowledge is grounded in the joint agency. On Souza's view, the knowledge is grounded in the hearer's participation in the joint agency. Okay, that's the key distinction here. So in that passage, he says the correctness of one's belief is still attributable in part to competence seated in one individually, even if more completely it's attributable to this broader collective competence. Okay? So what's really going to be important here for understanding Souza's view is to understand what this in part comes down to. What does it mean to attribute success in part to a competence seated in oneself individually? it's not clear, but here are some clues from Sousa. For Sousa, in order for a success, for example, forming a true belief, right? In order for success to be attributable to a competence, the success has to, according to him, manifest competence. But a success manifests competence only if the competence secures success in a modally stable way. Okay, so let's cash out that idea a little bit. So here's 3 quotes from Sousa. Getting it right, so getting the belief formed truly, getting it right as a manifestation of such a competence requires that the coincidence between belief and truth not be mere coincidence. The competence is supposed to secure a connection between the two, so that given your pertinent skill, shape, and situation, if you then think that P, you would be right. So that's a modal relation, right? Given your competence, given your skill, and you're in the right shape, you're not drunk, you're not drugged, and given the right situation, it's not a hall of mirrors, it's not like some kind of crazy Jennifer Lackey scenario, right? Given the right skill, the right shape, the right situation, it's not an accident, it's not a coincidence that you believe the truth. It's that if you were to believe within that profile, you would likely form a true belief, okay? So again, same idea. Aptness, or, attribution of success to competence. Aptness requires that the correctness of the belief, its being true, manifests a competence resident in the thinker and exercised on that occasion. And the required manifestation can take place only, and here's the modal condition again, only if the thinker would succeed in their attempt to get it right on whether P, by judging that P. So that would succeed is expressing a counterfactual, right? That has a kind of modal strength to it, a modal robustness to it. Again, the thinker must be in a position to know on that matter. The thinker must be in a position to know on that matter, must enjoy the pertinent skill, shape, situation profile, such that if they believe through the employment of that profile, they would get it right. Now, the problem I see for Sousa is essentially this. In many cases of testimonial knowledge, especially the interesting ones where, say, like, you are expressing the kind of vulnerable dependence that I think is interesting, right? Maybe a small child trusting their teacher or their parent, maybe you believing your lawyer or your doctor, right? Where, you don't have any independent guarantee that they're credible, that they're reliable. You're kind of relying that they know what they're talking about in this instance, right? The problem for Sousa is essentially this. In many cases of testimonial knowledge, there is no confidence in the hearer that has that required modal profile. That is, there's no, what he calls an SSS competence in the hearer, such that if they believe through the employment of that profile, they would get it right. On the contrary, the required modal profile belongs to the relevant joint agency rather than any disposition in the hearer that account for the hearer's participation in that joint agency, okay? So I agree with Sousa that in order to have knowledge, there has to be this like modally robust relationship between the truth and your belief. It can't be just like an accident that your belief is true. There's got to be this modally robust profile between the relationship between your belief and the truth of your belief. What I'm saying is that you can't always account for that modal robustness by looking at just what's going on in the hearer. Sometimes you have to look at the joint agency between the hearer and the speaker working together, cooperating together. And that's what's creating that modally robust relationship, not anything that's just going on in the hearer by themselves, okay? So we can elaborate on that point by distinguishing between two kinds of competence. And I think that Sousa sometimes gets away with being conflating between these two kinds of competence, okay? So let's say a type 1 competence is a general competence to be successful in the relevant kind of joint agency under a variety of relevant conditions. For example, a professional basketball player has a type 1 competence to complete passes. Okay, so you take a professional basketball player, you put them in any broad scope, broad variety of relevant situations, and they have that competence to be able to, catch passes that are thrown to them, etc. Okay? A type 2 competence would be a narrow competence to be successful in the relevant kind of joint agency, but in some very highly specific set of circumstances. For example, a small child has a type 2 competence to complete passes when an adult is making all manner of specific adjustments to enable success. Okay? So this is a nice feature of joint agency, is that it allows for various contributions from the participants, right? So in a professional basketball game, you've got a highly skilled passer and a highly skilled receiver of that pass, right? But there's still joint agency there, right? There's still that common intention, that shared attention, that common understanding of the shared intention, etc., right? Now, how about when you're teaching a child to play catch? I don't know if you've ever taught a child to play catch, but I'm talking about a really small child. You have to throw that ball just exactly right. You have to put it just at the right speed, just with the right force, exaggerate your motion so they kind of get their timing correct. The kid is still a participant in the shared agency, that joint agency. And the kid might be very reliable in catching the ball, so long as you are making sure that everything's going just right for that to happen, right? So it's still joint agency. If you were to ask what explains the success, it wouldn't be just the child, it wouldn't be just the adult, it would be that they're doing this thing together, and that's what's explaining how the child is not just accidentally ending up catching the ball, but reliably catching the ball with a kind of modal robustness to that success, right? So the modal robustness of the child's success is attributable to the joint agency, not to anything that's going on in the child herself, okay? Okay. So if you look at, if you were trying to explain the success of the child, it wouldn't be via type 1 competence, because the child doesn't have a type 1 competence. It's not via the type 2 competence either, because that by itself doesn't explain the success. It's the broader joint agency that explains the success. Okay? So I'm going to say the same thing about Sousa's testifiers. Okay? So similarly, for interesting cases of testimonial knowledge, let's say a child getting knowledge from the testimony of their parent, there's no type 1 testimonial virtue or testimonial competence in the child, because if you lied to the child, they would believe you, right? Children are gullible. Okay. If you had a bad actor come in and start testifying to the child, they would be fooled. That's why we protect children from bad actors like that. Okay. But again, neither does the type 2 competence explain the child's success. it's the broader joint agency that explains the child's success. So once again, I agree that there has to be that robust modal relationship between truth and belief, but it's going to be grounded in the broader joint agency, not in the child's participation in the joint agency, okay? So that's why if you go back to Souza's, I actually don't know how to go back to it, but Souza's idea that that in testimonial knowledge, the belief is attributable in part to the competence seated in the person individually, and if you're going to interpret that in terms of manifesting a modal robustness between belief and success, belief and truth, you're not going to be able to keep Souza's view. He wants the view to be, in all cases of knowledge, including testimonial knowledge, the knowledge is, the success manifests the virtue of the knower. And what I'm saying is that in these interesting testimonial cases, the success doesn't manifest the virtue of the knower. So, conclusion, and I'm sorry I did go over a little bit.
It's okay.
But in conclusion, we need to make a distinction between anti-reductionist views and anti-individualist views of testimonial knowledge. The two can come apart, and in particular, not all anti-reductionist accounts are also anti-individualist accounts. I think it's anti-individualism rather than anti-reductionism that best captures the spirit of the social turn in epistemology. That knowledge, for example, testimonial knowledge, sometimes entails vulnerable dependence on other persons and on the broader social environment. Not all virtue theories are anti-individualist. So in particular, Socrates and Souza's are not. But a virtue theoretic account can be anti-individualist depending on how we understand the details. And so, thank you.
Yeah, great. Amazing talk. Thanks a lot, Greg. John, please raise your hands to make questions. Matthew?
Okay, thank you. So I'm very sympathetic to some of the main line of the talk. My question though is about the kind of central role you gave to the case of joint action. So I think very plausible that to put things very in a very general way as you did, but at least sometimes as knowledge that B depends on certain epistemic properties of the social environment.
Right.
But it seems to me that in many cases that's not really an issue of joint action. So I just make an example. I go to the supermarket and I don't know where the salt is, and I ask a worker where is the salt, and he tells me. It's not a case of joint action because we don't share, at least in this narrow sense, so we don't share any intention, we don't have any common plan, nothing of the case. But still, it seems to me that there's some kind of social scaffolding such that the worker is, among other things, as kind of epistemic roles. He's there to provide with information. So it seems to me you have many cases where our agency is kind of coordinated through this kind of social role, but it's much broader than joint agency, at least if it's supposed to presuppose that we do share plans and intentions and so on. So I would talk more generally with something like coordinated agency, which
So in a sense, for your major point, which is that not all social epistemic dependence that we're interested in manifest joint agency.
Right, yeah.
I agree with you on that point. So here's the broader notion of social epistemic dependence. Let's just put it in terms of knowledge here, okay? And I want to agree with you that joint agency is not the only way to fulfill these conditions.
Sure.
So maybe group knowledge might be an example. Maybe, maybe not, but maybe group knowledge, is a kind of another sort of phenomenon in which you get those conditions fulfilled in a different way. Okay. That said, okay. But I want to say that, but that the notion of shared agency or joint agency, I think, does get you a way to fulfill these conditions. And so now the question becomes, how expansive can you be here in terms of understanding social epistemic dependence in terms of joint agency? And in the transmission of knowledge, my focus was on face-to-face individual exchanges where you are involved in what I think of as a speech act that is actually dedicated to the transmission of knowledge or the sharing of knowledge. So I depend on speech act theory to say that in a typical speech act, you have a kind of joint agency. In a typical speech act, the speaker and the hearer share an intention, an intention to communicate in some way, and they also share a commitment to pull off that communication. Okay, so in your particular example, I would see that as shared agency. I think the social scaffolding that you're talking about is this common linguistic practice, which includes not just identifying each other's meanings, but identifying each other's speech acts. So when you ask, where is the salt? Was that the example?
Right,
yeah. When you ask, where is the salt, he understands that you are presuming that he knows where the salt is, and that you're asking him to share that knowledge. And when he tells you that the salt's over there, you understand that he intends to give you what you are asking for. And if it didn't get pulled off smoothly, you all would work it out until he successfully shared his knowledge of where the salt is. So in that particular case, I would understand it as falling under this rubric of transmitting knowledge within a context of shared agency. Mm-hmm. But I take your point, nevertheless, that there might be other cases where that account is not going to work. Yeah. One of my present research agendas is to see how expansive can you make this. So I think that there are all kinds of social practices. For example, reading food labels, reading street signs that tell you what direction to go into, the Centro or whatever, right? I think there are all kinds of social practices where there's a kind of shared intention and shared understanding, common understanding of that shared intention, and then a kind of cooperation that puts the communicative signs in place so that you create this easy, fluid transmission of knowledge, like it's just all over the place, but that it can be understood in this broader notion of a kind of joint agency by a participation in common social practices. But anyway, that's, like I said, I'm not defending the account. I'm sort of like just displaying, how you might get this kind of social epistemic dependence to work in various scenarios.
Yeah. I have a follow-up. I have the same words that Matthew underlined, because it seems to me that joint acceptance theory is a bit internalistic, because it demands that common knowledge of intention, so there is an internalistic sense to that. However, there are more externalistic models that we can fulfill with this approach. For instance, Alexander Bird model is a distribution model, a functionalist model. Suppose that we have three persons, a physicist, a mathematician, and an assistant. They are a team, a such team in science. Dr. X is the physicist, proves that P, some physical stuff. The mathematician proves that P implies Q, but they do the work without knowing the research field of each other, and they send the results to the assistant, and the assistant get the information together, make the Mons-Pones, and publish the conclusion Q. But the assistant do not understand anything of maths nor of physics, so none of individual members grasp the meaning of Q.
Yeah.
But it seems that the group knows that Q.
Right.
So in that case, I do not see the common knowledge of intention and so on, but it seems an anti-individualistic approach. Yeah. So my question is a follow-up of Matthias' question. Why do not accept a functionalist model? Because with a functionalist model, you can say, in some cases, joint acceptance work. In other cases, we need we can work with a cognitive distribution that is more externalistic.
Right.
So the point is, why not accept a more general theory that holds with different kind of cases?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to make a distinction between shared agency and group agency. Okay. So shared agency, the way I'm understanding it, is when two individuals are doing something together. Whereas group agency is when a collection of individuals do something as a group. So you need some kind of more stringent group identity conditions, like it's a jury, or it's a corporation, or it's a scientific research team, where you're going to have some notion of a group over and above just the sum of individuals, right? Whereas in shared agency, you don't necessarily have that. You just have, when you and I decide to go to the restaurant together, we don't now act as a group agent, we act as two individuals doing something together. So I'm modeling this testimonial exchange on that shared agent. I don't think that every time there's testimony, some kind of group forms, okay? So that's why I would not apply the group agency, okay? And that also has to do with your functionalist account. Because if you just have two individuals doing something together, there's not necessarily the kind of structural relationships there that you get a functional account of group belief or a functional account of group action. There's just not enough structure there to support the functionalist, right? So you need, if you're going to apply your functionalist account to groups, you need a group that has the kind of complicated structure that would support a functionalist account. Okay, so that would be the reason why I think you need different models to understand social epistemic dependence in different ways. But then I also would want to just make the same concession that I made before, which is that, I'm not committed to saying that the joint agency account is going to explain all cases of social epistemic dependence, right? I just want to make one kind of superficial remark about the view being internalist. No, for me, internalism is the idea that the whole story supervenes on facts that are internal to the individual. the fact that, you know, testimony requires speaker intention or hearer understanding of the intention, that doesn't make it internalist, because like all these other things have to be in place as well, which are not going to be understood as internal to the individual. So I think I agree with you that your account has to be externalized. So for example, my account is reliabilist, right? You don't get testimonial knowledge unless there's a reliable exchange between the believer and the hearer and the speaker. So it's a kind of reliabilism. Yeah. So I reject the accusation of internalism.
Good.
All right.
So let's move on for next question. Ben?
Did you have a question?
Okay.
Yes, thank you. This is very naive and stems from my ignorance about the subject, which I apologize for. So when you talked about Zabzewski's view, you said that it's it's individualistic but anti-reductionist. And I was wondering, well, so first of all, she defines the having justified testimonial knowledge as being basically reasonable trust in something else.
Yeah.
So why isn't that a reduction? So I guess what I'm asking is the meaning of reductionism, which I admit that it's a bit too late in this work to inquire about, but that's basically the question. Why isn't her view reductionist in some sense, I guess?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So it's actually a great question. And I think that if you were just to read this, I agree with you, that could be interpreted in a reductionist way.
Yeah.
Because it all depends on what she means by conscientious self-reflection. If conscientious self-reflection requires that I go through some kind of inductive argument that the person is actually reliable and their testimony is reliable, then that would be a reductionist interpretation of that. I think the only reason I'm not giving that, I'm not like leaving room for that interpretation is because I know Zagzebski, okay? And I know other parts of her view where she explicitly rejects that. And she thinks that when she says that trust can be a reason to believe, she's opposing that to the kind of evidentialist reasons that a reductionist would be happy with, right? So when she talks about trust can be a reason to believe as long as it's reasonable trust. And it's reasonable trust as long as it satisfies my own conscientious self-reflection. I interpret that self-reflection, whatever it is, it's not what the reductionist wants. It's either just a kind of default justification theory. I can't find any defeaters. I can't find any evidence against. Or it's going back to some kind of non-reasoning competence in the believer, in the hearer, to sort of, evaluate whether this person's trustworthy. Do I have any reasons to doubt that? Things like that. So so I think it's an excellent question. I think it sort of like shows me that for oral ISID that could be viewed in a reductionist way. So it's really other parts of Zagzebski that make me just like not read her that way. Yeah. Okay.
So let's move on to Tiago.
Thank you very much. I just have a simple question, because I like the model that is proposed. I don't have any objection to it, but isn't it kind of arbitrary just to proposed social epistemic dependence as a way to define what is individualistic and what is not individualistic. And because I believe and I agree with you that the reductionists versus non-reductionism is a dead debate. It won't lead to any answers. But is individualism the only way that the debate can have some sort of social component that is significant? Or
Yeah.
Have you thought of another way to define this social
Yeah.
character without the epistemic dependence?
Yeah, so that's another great question. So what I'm trying to do, again, like I talked about this very, very shortly at the beginning of the talk. I'm looking at all these conversations in social epistemology. I'm trying to figure out, one, what do they all have in common? And my answer is, well, they're all exploring varieties of social epistemic dependence. And by that I mean varieties of ways in which epistemic standing, whether it be of an individual or a group or whatever, or of a system, they're all exploring various ways in which epistemic standing can be dependent on relationships to other persons or relationships to other features of the social environment, such as structural features, for example, or political features, or something like that, right? But then, so fine. So I think that sort of explains what they're all doing. It also explains why they're all doing something that's related to each other, and maybe in a way that we should be more interested in, like cross-fertilization. So, for example, I think that a lot of the people who are involved in the epistemology of testimony they're trying to figure out the good case. Like, what does testimonial knowledge look like when things go right, right? Whereas a lot of people who are talking about epistemic injustice or about white ignorance or something like that, they're looking at the bad case. How can things go wrong, including with the social environment, right? And so my thing is, well, if you have a theory of the good case, that entails a theory of the bad case. And if you have a theory of the bad case, that at least implicitly assumes a theory of the good case, right? You can't, right? So there's a way in which we're all talking about the same thing, we're just coming at it from different angles. So I think that framework of social epistemic dependence gives you like a lot of explanatory power to understand, like, why are we all doing social epistemology? What do we have in common here, right? But then my second point is that mere dependence is uninteresting. Here's why. The arch Enlightenment individualist like Descartes or Locke would happily agree that we depend on each other for our education, for our training in various ways, right? But it's kind of like just a causal dependence that like gives us our own resources that we can now go off as individuals and evaluate the world and evaluate other people. So there's a sense in which they recognize a kind of social epistemic dependence like anybody would. That's trivial, right? That's trivial, that's uninteresting. So if we're going to get at what's important and interesting about this social term, it can't be that. And that's where this notion of vulnerable dependence comes in. And now that's a substantive argument that I would have to make in these different conversations to say, look, what's really interesting that's going on here is, this view, right? There are reductionists in the epistemology of testimony, who are also individualists in the epistemology of testimony, and they're doing social epistemology, but they've missed the point. They've missed what's interesting about social epistemology, okay? So that's just gives you a little more background to why I think this is the way to go at it. But again, it's not, I haven't given you any knockdown argument that this is the right way to go, but I'm seeing explanatory power here when you start looking at these different conversations.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah, okay.
We have time for one more question. Please raise your hands. Okay, I have one. It's a clarificatory question because I like the concept of vulnerable dependence. I think it's an interesting concept. But I have a worry concerning that concept. It seems that vulnerable dependence seems to be a case, and it seems to be related with accidental or lucky success. And if you have a case of lucky, epistemic lucky or accidental success, we cannot have knowledge because knowledge is incompatible with lucky.
Right.
So, how do you manage that?
Yeah. So I think that this is the business of epistemology, right? So we all agree, or at least everybody I grew up agrees, everybody I grew up with agrees, that there's some sense in which knowledge can't be just lucky.
Yeah.
Knowledge
And
can't just be
vulnerability
lucky.
seems lucky.
So the question is, how do you understand that? It's not that knowledge can't be lucky in any way,
Yeah.
right? Because I'll tell you what. As soon as I got off the train, I almost got hit by a scooter because I didn't realize how you all are so crazy with the scooters, right? So I'm just lucky to be alive, but that doesn't prevent me from knowing that there's a computer on the table, right? So right, I'm just lucky that I was born into the kind of resources that I was able to get a good education. Now I know all sorts of things because of that good education. But that doesn't prevent me from knowing what I have now that I have that good, right? So the whole question is to understand, well, in what sense can knowledge not be lucky, right? And for a long, long tradition in Western epistemology, that non-accident, that non-lucky condition was understood in terms of self-reliance or self-sufficiency. Mm-hmm. It's not lucky in that I have my own guarantees that I'm going well here. And so if I were to rely on my education, it's because I know that my education is a good education. Or if I'm going to rely on your testimony, it's because I know you're a good testifier, right? So it's all self-sufficiency. It's all self-reliance, ultimately.
Yeah.
The externalist is the first person to say, that's not going to work. You, to some extent, you're lucky to be in an enabling perceptual environment. If you're in a house of mirrors, you're out of luck. Right? You won't be able to trust your perception, right? So the externalist, this is why so many people are dissatisfied with externalism, because they don't want knowledge and reasonable belief and rational belief to be dependent on the external environment in the way that, right? Yeah. This is why so many people are dissatisfied with the social turn in epistemology, because individualism dies hard. People don't like that kind of idea that you're vulnerable to the social environment, that you're vulnerable to other people. But look, if you're not trained in Western epistemology, it's just common sense. Right? That your perceptual knowledge depends on you being in a physical environment that supports human perception. Yeah. And your testimonial knowledge to some degree depends on you not being in an extremely hard to detect deceptive situation. So it's like we need to engineer good social environments in order for us to function well epistemically. I think that's just common sense. That's why we're talking about, like, well, what are we going to do about all this online hate speech and these epistemic bubbles, right? It has to do with, like, creating an environment where we can actually function that's enabling rather than disabling of our cognitive functioning. So yeah, I would say that that kind of vulnerability, where vulnerability is in this technical sense of not having knowledge or an epistemic guarantee that what you're relying on is reliable, that's just externalism.
Yeah.
And we're just adding that, we're just adding the social realm.
Yeah.
Okay? Once I started thinking of it this way, I started thinking that what an odd position to be an externalist but not an anti-individualist. Because think about how odd that position is, right? You're saying that yes, human knowledge is dependent on an enabling physical environment, but not on an enabling social environment. Why? What would possibly be the motivation for that, right? For that, once you see that that kind of self-sufficiency and self-reliance is like a myth, and that you need an enabling physical environment for all kinds of just, regular human knowledge, why would you stop there? Why would you not say, and you also need an enabling social environment? Yeah, so that's, yeah, okay.
A small comment. Only. But I think there are degrees of vulnerability. And if you if you have a high degree of vulnerability, it's like the model condition of knowledge.
Right.
It does not work.
Right.
So it's like the fake barn case.
Right.
A high degree of vulnerability. It
Right.
seems like the fake barn case in
Right.
which you do not have knowledge because of
Right.
the environment is not feasible
Right.
enough to the knowledge. So it seems that not all. It seems to me that not all cases of vulnerability give or
No,
are conducive to knowledge. So have you some fine tuning of the?
No, but think about how a virtue theoretic account, and let's even go back to the individualist, okay? When we suppose we still want to say, like Zagzebski does or that Sousa does, that knowledge is grounded in the competence of the individual knower, okay? And a competence there is reliable competence, right? So for both Sousa and Zagzebski, there's this reliability condition, but the seat of reliability is the virtues of the good cognitive character of the knower, okay? That's a way to cash out the non-accidentality condition, right? Now, it's not just an accident that you got the truth.
Yeah.
Your belief was formed by competent agency, and so it's not just an accident that you got the truth. Just like it's not just an accident that Pele scored the goal, right? It's like he's highly skilled. He knew what he was right. He's competent. He's got this excellence that explains why it wasn't just an accident. Okay, so virtue theory interprets that non-accidentality condition, that no accident condition, in terms of competent agency. I'm just saying that it's not always individual agency. Sometimes it's joint agency. Sometimes it's competent joint agency that explains why it's no accident that the child's belief that there's milk in the refrigerator is true. The child and the mother cooperated to make sure that the child's question was answered correctly. So it's no accident that you know that the salt is over there, because you were in an exchange that sort of guaranteed that the salt, not guaranteed in an infallible sense, but in a sense that explains the non-accidentality condition. Yeah.
That is good. Okay. So let's wrap up, and let's thank a lot Greco for this amazing talk again and for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you.